1 minute ago, almost 300 miles off the Oregon coast, a volcano buried beneath a mile of dark Pacific water crossed a threshold that made veteran seismologists choose a phrase they almost never use: megaquake warning. Axial seamount, a submerged giant invisible from any beach, is now inflating faster than at any point since sensors were bolted into its flanks. The seafloor beneath it is lifting by centimeters instead of millimeters. Chains of tiny earthquakes are shaking its summit and spreading along the ridge that connects it to the rest of the plate. If this underwater mountain fails in the wrong way, it will not just bleed lava into the deep. It could hurl the ocean itself at the Pacific Northwest and give one of North America's most dangerous faults a hard shove toward rupture. Far out in the dark water off Oregon beyond the fishing boats and shipping lanes, the seafloor does not lie flat. It rises into a broad, drowned mountain axial seamount. From the surface, it is invisible. No island, no plume of steam, just open Pacific stretching to the horizon. But if you could drain away the ocean, you would see a volcano as tall as some of the Alps sitting astride a spreading ridge where the Juan de Fuca plate tears itself apart. To most people on the coast, axial is just a name in a scientific report. To the researchers who watch it, it is one of the most restless volcanoes on Earth. For decades, axial was only a rough outline on sonar maps and scattered ship surveys. Scientists knew it erupted from time to time, laying fresh sheets of lava across the seafloor, but they rarely caught it in the act. That changed when a fiber optic cable was laid from the Oregon coast out along the ridge and up over the volcano's flanks. Suddenly, axial was no longer a distant guess. It became one of the most closely monitored pieces of seafloor on the planet. Pressure recorders sit on its summit, able to detect when the crust lifts by less than the thickness of a sheet of paper. Seismometers listen for the faintest snap of cracking rock. Hydrophones hear low rumbles and sharp pops that never reach the surface. Cameras stare into shimmering hydrothermal vents where hot, chemical-rich water rises straight from the volcano's interior. This network has already watched axial go through an entire cycle of inflation and eruption. In 2011 and again in 2015, the seafloor swelled for years as magma crept into a shallow reservoir beneath the summit. Then in a matter of hours, the pressure dropped. The seafloor suddenly subsided by tens of centimeters as lava broke out along fissures pouring across the deep ocean floor. For scientists, those events were proof that the instruments worked, a rare chance to see in real time how a submarine volcano breathes in and out. For people on land, they passed almost unnoticed. The eruptions were large by undersea standards but far from shore, and the waves they created were small. The current episode looks different. Instead of a slow, steady swell, the uplift at axial has accelerated to rates that rival or exceed anything seen before, compressed into a much shorter time. Swarms of microquakes are not just clustered at the summit, but marching outward along the ridge, hinting that stress is spreading into the broader plate boundary. Heat and chemistry at the vents are shifting in ways that point to fresh, gas-rich magma rising closer to the seafloor. Taken alone, any one of these signals would be worth attention. Taken together and viewed against the backdrop of the Cascadia Subduction Zone that already threatens the Pacific Northwest with a future magnitude 9 earthquake, they raise a more unsettling possibility. This is not just another routine eruption cycle on an isolated undersea volcano. It is a change in a critical piece of the plate system that underpins an entire coast. The ports of Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, the coastal towns lined with wooden houses, the highways and bridges that thread along estuaries and river mouths, all of them sit within reach of whatever axial does next. No one on the beach can see the volcano swelling in the dark or hear the microquakes ticking through the crust. But in control rooms on shore, those signals are already drawing a new outline around a threat that is both closer and more complicated than a simple burst of lava in deep water. At first glance, an underwater eruption hundreds of miles offshore sounds like the kind of event the wider world can afford to ignore. Lava would pour out into the dark, cool quickly into pillow-shaped rock, and the ocean above would barely ripple. For many mid-ocean volcanoes, that picture is close to the truth. But axial seamount is different, and the signals coming from it now point to a threat that does not end at the edge of the continental shelf. The first reason is the speed and scale of the pressure buildup. In past cycles, axial's summit lifted slowly as magma rose into its shallow reservoir, swelling the seafloor by a few millimeters each month. Today, that uplift has surged into centimeters over the same interval, with bursts where the seafloor has heaved upwards by around a centimeter in just a couple of days. That does not sound like much until you remember that this motion involves kilometers of crust being forced upward by a growing pool of molten rock. It is the difference between a balloon slowly filling on a table and the same balloon being pumped hard in someone's hands. The mechanical limits of the surrounding rock are being approached much faster than before. Layered on top of that, the way the crust is breaking has changed. Hundreds of tiny earthquakes a day now rattle the summit and its flanks, most of them too small for anyone on shore to notice, but loud and clear on the seismometers bolted to the seafloor. In earlier cycles, these quakes clustered tightly around the central magma system. Now they are marching outward along the spreading ridge, lighting up faults that connect axial to the broader plate boundary. Each event is a small release of stress, but together they trace a pattern of strain that is no longer neatly contained within the volcano itself. The plumbing is under pressure and the surrounding crust is starting to feel it. The second reason this awakening is so worrying lies in what sits above that stressed rock. Axial's summit and flanks are not just piles of loose ash. They are thick stacks of heavy basalt flows, fractured but still massive. If magma intrudes into those layers and destabilizes part of the edifice, the failure may not be a gentle cracking open of fissures. It could involve a section of the volcano's flank or caldera floor collapsing suddenly into the chamber below. On land, that would already be bad. Underwater, a rapid displacement of rock and water can shove a dome of ocean outward, creating a tsunami that races toward shore before most people even know something has happened offshore. Because Axial sits relatively close to the margin of the continent, the warning time for any near-field wave would be brutally short. Tsunamis generated by distant earthquakes in the Pacific can take many hours to cross the ocean, giving coastal communities time to react. A wave born only a few hundred kilometers offshore is different. Models of hypothetical collapses and seafloor failures at Axial suggest that the first surge could reach parts of the Oregon and Washington coasts in tens of minutes, not hours. In some scenarios, the time between a disturbance on the seafloor and the arrival of dangerous water at the beach is shorter than the time it takes to clear low-lying towns using existing roads. In that kind of event, hesitation is as dangerous as the wave itself. The third layer of concern reaches even deeper into the Cascadia Subduction Zone that lurks just off the Pacific Northwest. Here, the oceanic plate that carries Axial on its back is forced beneath North America along a fault hundreds of kilometers long. Geological evidence shows that Cascadia has produced giant earthquakes in the past, with magnitudes near 9, lifting and dropping whole stretches of coastline and launching tsunamis across the ocean. For now, Cascadia is quiet, building up stress in silence. But when Axial inflates cracks and shifts, it is not doing so on a separate stage. It is deforming part of the very plate that is locked and loaded along the subduction zone. No one can say that an eruption or collapse at Axial would automatically trigger a Cascadia megaquake. Earth is not a simple line of dominoes, and most perturbations pass without dramatic consequences. But studies of past events around the Pacific Rim have shown that large ruptures and sudden redistributions of stress can nudge other faults closer to their breaking point, altering the odds in subtle but important ways. The more suddenly and violently Axial changes shape, the more carefully scientists have to watch how stress along the nearby subduction interface responds. In a region where millions of people already live with the knowledge of a future magnitude 9, any additional push on the system is taken seriously. Put together, these threads form a picture that is hard to dismiss. A volcano with a direct fiber optic line to shore is swelling faster than before. The crust around it is cracking not just in its core but along the connected ridge. The rock above its magma chambers is heavy enough that a structural failure could move huge volumes of water in an instant. And all of this is happening on the same small tectonic plate that is slowly diving under the coastlines of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Axial does not have to do its worst for this to matter. Even a moderate seafloor disturbance in the wrong place at the wrong time could send a damaging wave toward a coast that also sits on top of one of the most dangerous faults in North America. To understand why Axial's awakening is taken so seriously, you have to see it the way scientists do not, as a vague bump on a bathymetric map, but as a wired machine whose every twitch is being recorded. That perspective starts with a cable that leaves the Oregon coast, vanishes into deep water, and then reappears in the dark as a web of instruments bolted directly into the volcano. Along Axial's summit and flanks, bottom pressure recorders sit in pressure housings on the seafloor. Their job is simple and brutal. endure cold, crushing depths and measure how high the water column above them is down to a fraction of a millimeter. If the seafloor rises, the water column gets shallower and the recorded pressure drops. If the seafloor subsides, the opposite happens. Taken over months and years, those tiny shifts draw a clean curve of inflation and deflation as magma flows into and out of the volcano's shallow reservoir. In earlier cycles, that curve rose gently like a slow exhale. In the current one, it has steepened the line, bending upward in a way that is hard to ignore. Scattered across the same summit are seismometers, some buried in sediment, others anchored to bare lava. They listen continuously to the crust. Distant earthquakes arrive as smooth waves that roll through the entire region. Local events from axial itself are sharper, higher in frequency and clustered in space. Software onshore and along the cable picks apart these signals, locating each microquake in 3 dimensions. On maps in the observatory, the events appear as dots that flare and dim with time. When the system is quiet, the dots are sparse, concentrated in a few known fault zones. In the months leading up to previous eruptions, those dots thicken directly under the summit before migrating along fissures where lava eventually broke out. Today, the pattern is more complex. A dense cloud of microquakes still hangs under the central caldera, but spokes of activity reach outward along the rift zones, extending onto the broader spreading ridge. It is as if the volcano's stress is no longer confined to a single chamber and its immediate surroundings, but is being transmitted along the cracks and weaknesses of the plate boundary itself. That does not guarantee a larger event, but it tells seismologists that axial's plumbing and the surrounding crust are interacting on a wider stage than before. Above the seafloor, hydrophones, underwater microphones, record the sounds that never reach the air. Low rumbles give away magma moving at depth, while sharp cracks mark rock failure or gas-driven explosions at vents. When these acoustic signals line up with clusters of earthquakes and changes in pressure, they help pin down what is happening and where. Cameras at hydrothermal sites add a visual layer, shimmering plumes of hot water, sudden bursts of cloudy fluid, or new chimneys growing where none existed before. Combined with chemical samples brought up by research ships, water enriched in helium-3 metals and volcanic gases, they offer a direct taste of how much fresh magma is feeding the system and how close it is to the surface. Over all of this, satellites provide a different view. Conventional radar methods struggle through a kilometer of water, but changes in the shape of the broader plate and the coastline can still be tracked. Onshore GPS stations and coastal tilt meters measure how the margin of North America flexes as the Juan de Fuca plate grinds beneath it. Small shifts in that flexing can be compared with what the cabled instruments see offshore, helping geophysicists understand how axial's inflation fits into the wider pattern of strain across the Cascadia region. The data stream from axial does not flow into a single computer on someone's desk. It pours into multiple centers in real-time university labs, government observatories, and emergency management offices. Each has dashboards tuned to different thresholds. A slow, steady increase in uplift might only trigger a routine bulletin to the scientific community. A sudden change, a sharp acceleration of pressure drop in one sector, a burst of seismicity lining up along a known fault, an abrupt shift in vent chemistry, sets off alerts that pull experts into video calls at odd hours. They cross-check raw records, rerun automatic picks, and look for corroboration across independent sensors before deciding what the change really means. Because axial sits offshore, any warning system for people on land must bridge the gap between deep ocean data and coastal response. That bridge includes tide gauges along the Oregon and Washington coasts, which monitor sea level for unexpected pulses that could signal a wave on the way. It includes offshore pressure sensors beyond axial that can confirm whether a disturbance has actually pushed the water column around, not just shaken the rock beneath it. And it includes integration with global seismic networks so that an event at axial can be distinguished from or linked to other earthquakes on the Pacific Rim. In practice, there are several kinds of warnings the system can issue. One is scientific and long-term periodic assessments that say in careful language that axial is inflating faster than in past cycles, that seismicity is elevated and broadened, that the probability of an eruption or structural change has increased over a timescale of months to years. Another is operational and immediate, a sudden jump in seafloor motion, a large local earthquake at shallow depth near the volcano, or an unusual signal on multiple deep ocean pressure recorders can prompt authorities to issue rapid tsunami alerts, even if the source is not yet fully understood. In those rare minutes, decisions have to be made on incomplete information, guided by pre-planned thresholds and scenarios built long before the crisis. Even with all this technology, the system does not offer certainty. It cannot promise exact dates or rule out surprise. What it does provide is a set of eyes and ears in a place that used to be effectively blind, the deep ocean volcano that shares a tectonic plate with an already primed subduction zone. The more clearly scientists can see Axial's breathing patterns, the better they can distinguish between a routine exhale of lava into the deep and a more dangerous shift that threatens to move water and stress toward the coast. The instruments do not remove the risk. They simply give us a chance to see it forming, instead of discovering it only when the first wave hits the shore. For most people in the Pacific Northwest, the threat they imagine offshore is a distant abstract one, a someday magnitude 9. Cascadia earthquake that might or might not arrive in their lifetime. Axial seamount rarely enters that picture. Yet if you trace the lines of risk from the volcano up to the surface across the continental shelf and into the bays and river mouths that cut into Oregon and Washington, it becomes clear that what happens 300 miles offshore can reach all the way to kitchen tables and city halls. Along the coast, towns like Newport Seaside, Astoria, and Coos Bay sit at the end of narrow lowlands backed by hills but tied to the sea. Ports handle fishing fleets, timber exports, bulk cargo, and fuel. Highways and rail lines hug estuaries because that is where the flat ground is. In many of these places, sirens and blue evacuation signs already mark the routes to higher ground for a future Cascadia tsunami. Those same routes would be needed if a wave were born above Axial instead. The difference is time. A tsunami from a distant source gives emergency managers hours to confirm the threat, refine forecasts, and coordinate evacuations. A wave generated by a sudden failure at Axial might give them less than half an hour. That compressed timeline changes everything. Sirens and mobile alerts must be triggered based on deep ocean data and automatic thresholds, not after long discussion. People in low-lying zones may have to move as soon as they feel strong shaking or see the sea behave strangely without waiting for an official message. Drills that feel like a formality when the threat is measured in centuries become, in this context, a rehearsal for a race in which every minute matters. In some communities, planners have already studied how long it takes school children, elderly residents, and people with limited mobility to reach designated safe zones on foot. The uncomfortable answer is that in several vulnerable towns, there is barely enough time even if everyone leaves immediately. Beyond the immediate coastal strip, the consequences of a major undersea event at Axial ripple through the regional economy. The ports of Portland, Seattle, and Tacoma are not right on the outer coast, but they depend on infrastructure, that is. Channels must remain open, aids to navigation must function, and refineries and fuel terminals in estuaries must be intact. Strong shaking from an offshore eruption-related quake, a flank collapse, or a Cascadia event that is somehow nudged closer could damage docks, cranes, storage tanks, and bridges. Even if the wave itself loses energy before reaching deep inland waterways, landslides triggered along riverbanks and highways could sever supply lines. The Pacific Northwest's economy rests on more than physical goods. Data centers, technology companies, and financial services all rely on power grids and fiber optic cables, some of which cross or parallel the coast. An undersea event that damages offshore cables or shore landings could disrupt communications at the very moment when accurate information is most needed. Regional grids already vulnerable to earthquakes could be further strained by damage at coastal substations, or by the loss of generation capacity if dams and transmission lines in shaking zones are affected. An eruption at Axial by itself may not cause a blackout, but as part of a broader cascade of failures, it can help tip the system over the edge. For emergency managers and policymakers, the response to this complex threat is split into several fronts. One is technical and scientific, maintaining and upgrading the cabled observatory at Axial, ensuring that bottom pressure recorders, seismometers, and hydrophones are robust and integrating their data seamlessly into tsunami warning centers and regional hazard models. This also means investing in coastal tide gauges, offshore pressure sensors beyond the volcano, and onshore GPS and seismic networks, so that no single line of evidence has to carry the entire burden of detection. Another front is planning and land use. Coastal communities have begun to incorporate near-field tsunami scenarios into their zoning and building codes. New critical facilities, hospitals, emergency operations centers, fire stations, are increasingly sited on higher ground where possible. In some places, Vertical evacuation structures, reinforced towers or berms designed to withstand waves, are being considered or built as last resort refuges. These projects are expensive and politically difficult, but they are a recognition that the ocean's edge is not just scenic, it is conditional. The third front is public education and drills. Maps on a website are not enough if in the moment people freeze or turn to their cars in panic. Schools that once held earthquake drills alone now practice combined shake, then move uphill scenarios. Communities run siren tests and evacuation walks along the exact routes they would take in a real emergency. Outreach campaigns explain again and again that in some situations the correct response is to act on natural warning signs, strong, long-lasting shaking or unusual sea behavior, without waiting for an alert that may arrive too late. Finally, there is a quieter but crucial effort taking place in boardrooms and insurance offices. Many business policies contain exclusions for volcanic and seismic events. That means a company whose warehouse or port facility is damaged by shaking or a wave linked to axial may discover that their losses are only partially covered or not covered at all. Some firms are beginning to reassess their risk portfolios, diversify supply chains, and consider how long they could operate if coastal transport or power were disrupted. Governments, too, have to think about how they would fund reconstruction after a disaster that might hit a relatively small population, but a very significant share of the region's logistical backbone. None of these responses can eliminate the underlying hazard. Axial will continue to draw in magma to form crack and occasionally erupt, whether or not anyone is watching. The Cascadia Subduction Zone will continue to accumulate stress. What these measures can do is narrow the gap between the moment something goes wrong on the seafloor and the moment people on land understand what is happening and can act. In a landscape where warning time is measured in minutes and consequences in decades, that gap may be the most important space to shrink. In quiet conference rooms far from the roar of the Pacific axial seamount is at the center of a debate that cuts to the heart of modern hazard science. When does a restless system justify the word warning? And how do you use that word without breaking public trust? On one side are researchers who look at axial's behavior and see a familiar cycle pushed to an extreme but still within what a highly active mid-ocean volcano can do. They point out that axial has already gone through several inflation, eruption, deflation rounds since detailed monitoring began. In each case, the seafloor rose as magma pooled beneath the summit, seismicity climbed, and then the system vented through fissure eruptions that spread fresh lava across the deep sea floor. The current uplift may be faster, they argue, but the pattern, inflation cracking vent heating, still matches that well-studied template. To them, the most likely outcome over the next months or years is another submarine eruption that, while scientifically important, would be only modestly hazardous to people on shore. On the other side are scientists who see too many lines bending at once to be comfortable. They accept that axial has a history of breathing without catastrophic results, but they focus on what is different. This time, uplift rates that climb into centimeters over short intervals, microquake swarms that extend well beyond the caldera vent, chemistry shifting in ways that suggest an unusually gas-rich magma, and a tectonic setting where every change in stress has to be weighed against the locked Cascadia Subduction Zone. They do not predict an imminent disaster with a date and time. Instead, they argue that the system has moved into a higher risk configuration where low-probability, high-impact scenarios, such as a partial flank collapse or a sudden large rupture on a nearby fault, deserve more attention than before. Behind this disagreement are uncertainties baked into every model. To simulate a collapse or eruption at axial, you have to ask questions that do not have precise answers. How thick and strong is the volcanic edifice above the magma chamber? How fractured is it, and where are the weakest planes buried? How does the underlying Juan de Fuca plate bend and flex as magma intrudes? How close to failure in a mechanical sense is the Cascadia interface above which millions of people live? Shift those inputs and the outputs change dramatically. One version of a model may show a limited eruption, small seafloor deformation, and a negligible tsunami. Another, using slightly different assumptions about rock strength or slip area, may produce a wave several meters high at vulnerable coastlines and a noticeable change in stress along part of the subduction zone. Both runs are mathematically sound. Neither can claim to be the truth in advance. This uncertainty spills out of the lab into policy and communication. Emergency managers want clear thresholds. At this level of uplift or seismicity, we raise the alert. At this other level, we prepare for evacuation. Scientists trained to live with probabilities and error bars are wary of drawing lines that suggest more certainty than the data supports. If they speak too cautiously, they risk leaving communities underprepared. If they speak too strongly and nothing dramatic happens, they risk fueling cynicism the next time they issue a warning. There is also a deeper argument about how to interpret connections across the Pacific. Studies of past earthquakes have shown that major ruptures can shift stress across long distances and sometimes appear to cluster in time. But the statistical patterns are messy, and Earth is full of coincidences. When tremor and small quakes increase not just at axial, but also in other parts of the Ring of Fire, some researchers see the outline of a global system nearing one of its periodic adjustments. Others caution that human eyes are very good at seeing patterns in noisy data. If every uptick is framed as part of a looming chain reaction, real signals may be drowned in a flood of false alarms. Underneath the technical details is a quieter, more human question. What do we owe the people who live above these hidden machines? Residents of the Pacific Northwest did not ask to sit atop a locked subduction zone or share a tectonic plate with an inflating undersea volcano. Many have only recently learned what a future Cascadia earthquake could mean for their homes, jobs, and families. Now they are being asked to absorb another layer of risk that an eruption or structural change offshore might complicate or slightly accelerate that already daunting scenario. In private conversations, some scientists admit that they feel the weight of this knowledge. If they underplay axial's behavior and something large happens, people will rightly ask why they were not warned. If they overemphasize worst-case possibilities, they may feed a cycle of fear and fatigue that makes communities tune out. The compromise many are trying to reach is a kind of radical honesty about uncertainty, explaining that axial is behaving in ways that demand attention, that a range of outcomes from routine eruption to dangerous seafloor failure are on the table, and that preparation on land is a rational response not because a disaster is guaranteed, but because the cost of being blindsided is unacceptably high. In the end, the debate is not just about what axial will do, but about how we choose to live with systems that we can measure in exquisite detail but not fully control. The volcano is sending out its signals regardless. The argument among scientists is how to read them aloud in a way that is truthful, useful, and timely, before the seafloor writes the next line in a language everyone can understand. On a calm day in Portland, Seattle, or Vancouver, it is almost impossible to feel connected to a volcano hidden hundreds of miles offshore in a fault that has not broken in living memory. The streets are busy, the ports hum, ferries cross sheltered bays under low clouds. The Pacific looks like a backdrop, not a threat. Yet beneath that flat horizon, axial seamount is rising, cracking and venting in ways that say the plate carrying it is not at rest. And just beyond the coastline, the Cascadia Subduction Zone waits in its long, uneasy silence. The uncomfortable truth is that these systems do not operate on human schedules. They do not care about election cycles, fiscal years, or how long it has been since the last disaster was in the news. They operate on the slow arithmetic of stress and strength, how much force is being loaded into the crust, how weak the rocks are, how quickly that balance is changing. At axial, the numbers have shifted. The seafloor is inflating faster than in previous cycles. Microquakes are lighting up not just the summit, but the connected ridge. Heat and chemistry at the vents are telling us that fresh, volatile magma is moving upward. None of this guarantees a catastrophe. All of it says the machine offshore is more restless than before. For the Pacific Northwest, living with that restlessness means accepting a layered kind of risk. There is the long-term certainty that Cascadia will one day produce a massive earthquake and tsunami. There is the nearer-term possibility that axial will erupt again in the deep ocean with little impact beyond new lava on the seafloor. Between those poles lies a narrower but sharper band of scenarios in which changes at axial contribute to a damaging wave or a shift in stress that alters the timing and character of the region's next great rupture. Those are not odds anyone can calculate to a single percentage point. They are possibilities that must be taken seriously precisely because the cost of being wrong is measured not just in money, but in lives and decades of recovery. Preparation, then, is less about predicting the exact moment when rock will break, and more about refusing to be surprised when it does. It means continuing to fund and maintain the cabled observatory that watches axial breathe. It means hard choices about where to build and rebuild along low-lying coasts and investments in evacuation routes and vertical refuges that may never be used in anger, but cannot be conjured up after the water starts to move. It means teaching a generation of children that strong, long get gone is not just a slogan, but a reflex that can save their lives when shaking comes from offshore. Most of all, it means learning to live with honest uncertainty. The people who study axial cannot promise that this inflation will end quietly or that it will explode into the worst-case scenario. What they can say with confidence is that the seafloor is changing in ways that demand attention, that those changes are tied to a plate boundary already known to be dangerous, and that the window between a disturbance under a mile of water and consequences onshore could be brutally small. In that context, treating preparation as optional is itself a kind of gamble. One day, perhaps years from now, a graph in an observatory will spike, a pressure record will drop, a burst of seismicity will flare, or tide gauges along the coast will start to trace a pattern no one wants to see. When that happens, the minutes that follow will be shaped by decisions made long before about instruments, about buildings, about how seriously we took a volcano no one can see. Axial seamount will continue to rise and fall whether we watch it or not. The choice facing the Pacific Northwest is whether to face that movement with open eyes and a plan, or to keep staring at a calm horizon and hope that the deep never sends its next signal our way. If you're still watching, you've just spent a few minutes looking beneath a calm Pacific horizon at the hidden volcano that could one day rewrite life along this coast. Axial seamount is out of sight, but it should never be out of mind. Its slow rise and constant quakes are a warning that the ground we stand on depends on what happens deep below. Tell us in the comments, does this feel like a distant curiosity or a real threat for the Pacific Northwest? If this video changed the way you see the ocean, please like it, share it, and subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into Earth's most dangerous places.